So let's get into it. 5 tips that will help you productively, calmly, and without too much emotional turmoil work with ayahuasca through this process of transformation and healing. Tip number 1, the one I wish I could give, is just let go of all expectations that you ever had and show up totally open to work with ayahuasca. If you are able to do that, and I'm not at LaWayra, please get my email from Sam. Let me know. I will be your devoted student. That is super, super challenging to just let go of expectation. So the tip that I like to start with is number 1, simply identify your expectations. Identify your expectations. There's a very mean prank that I've heard of. I've never done it, but I have heard of it, and people have told me that it does actually work. The prank is you tell someone, hey, actually only 5% of the population can tell the difference in taste between whole milk, skim milk, and 2% milk. That person is probably like, oh, I can do that if they're not lactose intolerant. So you sit them down, you pour 3 cups of milk, whole milk, skim milk, 2% milk, and then you put a blindfold on so that they do a blind taste test. And the question is, can they distinguish it? So you give them the first cup, whole milk, drink a sip. Okay, cool. Put that down. You give them another cup of milk, give them 2%, whatever, take a sip. The prank is you take that 3rd cup of milk and switch it out with a cup of orange juice. Typically, when that person takes a sip, the acidity is such a surprise to their brain that they gag, some people even vomiting. That, I think, is a pretty great articulation of how our expectations control our experience of reality. I think the important thing to recognize from this prank is not that the expectation of that cup being milk is what made them gag or vomit. It's the fact that that expectation was unknown, right? And so on a subconscious level, what their brain was thinking is, this is going to be milk. I'm certain of it. And so they take a sip, and when it's orange juice, the orange juice is making them vomit. It's the distance between the reality and the expectation. But I think something very different would happen if that person was so reflective how their mind worked that they're like, I've been told this is milk, and so I have every right to expect that it will be milk, but of course this could be anything. So I'm going to be open to the taste. I think if they were able to consciously recognize that expectation, they wouldn't have such a strong reaction to the distance between the expectation and reality. You have them begin by tasting the milks, but you replace that 3rd cup with orange juice. Oftentimes what will happen is because the brain has prepared itself for milk, it expects a milk taste. When it tastes that surprise acidity, people will gag or even vomit. What am I doing with that prank? Why am I saying that? It's important that we understand that over here is what ayahuasca is going to make us feel. And let me tell you, we really can't even imagine all the things that ayahuasca can make us feel. Yes, there's the predictable stuff of nausea, vomiting, sweating, but it's as I said, this German business consultant can turn into a cat. We can't even imagine all the things that ayahuasca can do. Yes, sometimes it can be the crazy psychedelic stuff that we've all heard about. It can be visions. It can be hallucinations. Sometimes it's just purging. It's just strongly cleaning your body. Sometimes it feels like nothing. All of that is ayahuasca. It is milk. It is orange juice. It is lemonade, all sorts of things. So over here, the essence of ayahuasca, its inherent nature and function, regardless of what we have going on in our mind. But over here, oftentimes these 2 things aren't aligning. As I already talked about, we come in with a lot of difficult things standing in the way of our having a direct, assumption of what ayahuasca is going to be like. But as I talked about, oftentimes these 2 things don't align. There's the real thing over here, and there's what we expect. And there's a lot of forces in our life pushing these 2 things apart. This distance, I think, is captured well by that prank I was talking about. I don't think the person vomits from orange juice because they were expecting milk. I think they vomit because they don't know that they are expecting milk. So if you can imagine the internal monologue being, well, they said I'd be tasting milk, and so it makes sense for me to expect that there will be milk. But really, I closed my eyes and it could be anything in that cup. So let's see what it is. If that was their internal monologue and they drank the orange juice, I think they would have a normal or at least less strong reaction to it. Always, we are carrying around hundreds of expectations. It's kind of how the conscious human mind works. It tries to orient ourselves to the world around us through experience. And so right now, I'm expecting that gravity is going to continue working. I'm expecting that I'm going to have lunch today and then I'll be able to eat more food. I'm expecting that I'm going to be able to sleep through the night. Most of these things will probably happen, and that's why I have the expectation. But we don't always know how many and how deep these expectations go, to the point of we don't recognize, I'm expecting this to be milk because they told me it would be. The distance that we have between the reality of how ayahuasca will work and our expectations about it is filled by frustration and disappointment. And so I think the best way to close this gap is simply by sitting down, taking time to write down what do we think is going to happen. So tip number 1 is just sitting down and trying to close the distance by reflecting on what does our mind think ayahuasca is going to be like? What am I expecting? What are my intentions or desires for ayahuasca? And have those intentions become expectations. Do I expect them to happen? How I formed a mental model of ayahuasca through exposure to misleading media. And so my mental model is different from the reality of ayahuasca, which a lot of us haven't even experienced. Sitting down and working through that reflective process of understanding your mental projection of ayahuasca will help you be able to meet what ayahuasca is going to be. Every single one of you who comes to LaWayra will have an ayahuasca experience. It's just probably not going to be what you expected. And so understanding that we are expectation creating machines and figuring out what those machines are creating is a great way to start. So that's tip number 1. Simply sit down, be reflective, and try to identify all of the expectations you're bringing into your experiences with ayahuasca. Tip number 1 needs to be paired with tip number 2. So after you've identified the expectations that you're able to, tip number 2 is simply be open to the expansiveness of ayahuasca's toolbox. As I said, ayahuasca works in crazy expansive ways to bring people through the processes that they need to. But a lot of the times we have a very myopic or kind of narrow vision of how ayahuasca works. When identifying some of your expectations, a lot of people will probably find that one of their main expectations is that ayahuasca is just a psychedelic. And that mental model of what a psychedelic is will make up a big part of how they understand ayahuasca. This is actually one of the most common misconceptions people have about ayahuasca, is just thinking of it as a psychedelic. And it really limits what they're able to learn from their time here. Popular media about ayahuasca, one of the issues with it itself is very narrow in how it talks about, represents, and describes ayahuasca. We all exist in worlds that are kind of dominated by algorithms that prioritize the sensational and the extraordinary, the stuff that's going to grab your attention, make you click and watch some ads. And so these algorithms are going to highlight the most shocking things about everything. And that includes ayahuasca, which has some pretty shocking stuff to highlight. So a lot of people hear and think that the second you take ayahuasca, you're going to be puking and then you're going to pass out and you're not going to be able to move, or you're going to be pooping your pants, and then you're going to see these crazy visuals. You're going to travel to a different realm and talk to entities. This is what people think about because it's a lot of what society pushes on us to think of ayahuasca as. And with that expectation, we get a lot of people coming through ayahuasca that it seems that what they really want is just some wacky, powerful drug experience and a crazy story to tell. You will leave with some great stories, but if you're just looking for a powerful drug experience, I can tell you that you're probably coming to the wrong place. Burning Man might be a better choice for you. Ayahuasca has always been, and will continue to be, a medicine, not a drug. So please listen very carefully to the next thing. Deep psychedelic experiences, oftentimes characterized by visions, can happen. Of course, that is part of how ayahuasca works. But ayahuasca is so much more than just a vision-based psychedelic experience. And all of it is important, not just the wacky, powerful, trippy stuff. As I said, ayahuasca is a medicine for the body. It's a medicine for the mind. It's a medicine for the soul. What it is about is not just some crazy experience. It's really, in its essence, about healing and connecting with yourself, with the present moment, with each other, the people around us, our partners, our friends, our family, the people in the group that you'll be in when you're here at LaWayra. It's about connecting with nature and the earth, with the fact of consciousness, with life, God, the divine, source, oneness, whatever you want to call it. That's what ayahuasca is about. And every person is so different. The things that people need to go through this process of healing connection is so broad that ayahuasca works in very broad ways. One of the reasons that ayahuasca is so renowned as a medicine, the reason that people will travel from all over the world to come to South America to take ayahuasca, is because ayahuasca has the capacity to work in such expansive, specific ways for every single person. What people need, they receive, and ayahuasca can give it to them. Ayahuasca is so awe-inspiringly multifaceted. As I mentioned, for me, as someone who has personally done over 100 ceremonies, and I have seen hundreds and hundreds of people go through hundreds and hundreds of processes, still, I am surprised and impressed and mystified by ayahuasca's expansiveness and its capacity to work in a variety of ways. So it's important for us to step back and be humble in the mental model we're trying to create of ayahuasca. Just to cover it briefly, Fernando Artaita always emphasizes that there are kind of three broad categories of how ayahuasca works. The first one is the one that I've just talked about. It's the sort of psychedelic vision-based one, which is, we call it pinta. Visions, colors, patterns, essentially kind of a classic psychedelic trip. That is 1/3 of the broad kind of categorization of how ayahuasca works. The second category of ways in which we experience ayahuasca working is simply by feeling emotions. This is honestly the meat of ayahuasca. Feeling. They can be enjoyable, like love, euphoria, oftentimes peace, relaxation, a heightened sense of connection to some essence that we carry inside of us and really forget. It can be more challenging too. It can be really strong anger, pain, sadness, frustration. But whatever it is, if you are feeling a strong emotion in ceremony, that in itself is ayahuasca working, and we can miss it a lot of the time. The third category is essentially physical effects, which I'll talk about at length a little bit later. So those are the three categories. As I mentioned, psychedelic, that this is a powerful plant medicine, this is a powerful psychedelic, that's part of it. But we need to understand that what ayahuasca is much broader. It includes it, but it is not just that. Ayahuasca is very, very expansive. So tip number 2 is be open to the expansiveness of how ayahuasca will be working with you. Pairing that with having identified your expectations so that when that frustration comes up, that something is different, you can know it's an expectation, identify it as such, let it go, and then bring yourself back to just being open to how this medicine is going to be helping you, because it is going to be helping you, just probably not in the way you've predicted. I can say all of this, and yet without fail, every single month, someone is in Word Circle after ceremony, and they're pretty upset, and they're like, yeah, you know what, ayahuasca didn't work, I didn't get any visuals. And they go on to describe a classic connection for about 5 minutes with strong emotions, a lot of cleansing, memories from childhood coming up, all of that stuff. This experience is so common for us, so common for people in the ayahuasca space, that shamans have a joke about it. They say, if what you want are crazy visuals, it's better to buy a ticket and go to the movies. I'm spending so much time on visuals because that's one of the main misconceptions or kind of hyper-focuses that people bring in with ayahuasca. It's a great jumping off point for this zooming out that we need to do, being open to the expansiveness. So to sum up tip number 1 and tip number 2, ayahuasca is mysterious and it is awesome. Visuals are but one of the tools ayahuasca recruits from in its vast and expansive toolbox. What that toolbox will be oriented towards, all of those tools will be used to aid in ayahuasca's fundamental essence, which is performing and helping in deep inner work for healing and growth. This healing and growth is not going to happen in the way your conscious mind has projected. So the best thing you can do, the way to wrap up tip 1 and 2, is try to be open to and curious about everything that you experience, not just what you're expecting. In this way, being open to and curious about everything that happens, you will be in harmony with the flow of ayahuasca. Everything that is going to happen here at retreat is important and can be valuable in your work with ayahuasca. The question is, are you able to get with that importance, or will you be rejecting it because it's not what you're wanting or expecting? So number 1 and 2, identify your expectations, and then be open to the expansiveness of how ayahuasca works. Tip number 3 is practice patience. When you get here on your first day, you're going to sit down and Fernando, our shaman, is going to give a little speech to you. If you pay attention, you'll notice that one of the only pieces of advice that he gives you is patience. Being patient. Given that ayahuasca works in such complex, unpredictable ways, the best thing to do is to try our best to just relax and be patient. Patience is really, really challenging. I've noticed in my own spiritual path that I am incredibly impatient, but in ways that I had no idea I was. Patience is really hard in general, but particularly with ayahuasca. The practice of patience is another thing that's made way harder by the way people talk about ayahuasca in non-Indigenous spaces. Ayahuasca is sort of represented as this magic bullet that's going to solve all of our problems once and for all. You know, we hear things like, I took ayahuasca and it was like 10 years of therapy in one night. Or I had some enlightenment experience. My ego totally dissolved and I'm never going to suffer again. These sort of things do happen with ayahuasca, but it's not like a vending machine where you put in money and then you push in your code and you get exactly what you wanted. As far as I know, unfortunately, we can't just travel somewhere, take a drink of some bitter tea, and then just escape the human condition forever. We can't just teleport to our destination. If we did, we wouldn't know what to do once we got there, and probably the speed of it would tear us apart. Working with ayahuasca is a process, and processes unfold over time, requiring many different, seemingly insignificant factors to fall into place before we arrive at that desired outcome. I think a great analogy for understanding this process that plant medicine brings us through is thinking about the process required to create an apple. So let's say we have a desired outcome with ayahuasca, whatever you wrote down in your journal as being what you want from ayahuasca. For a lot of people, it is letting go of something, be it an addiction, mental health illness, some traumatic pattern of response that is, holding us back in life, or achieving something, finding our path in life, attaining some higher level of spiritual existence, being a calmer and more loving person. Let's call that our desired outcome. That's the apple. Right now, most of us live in a world where if we want an apple, all we have to do is get in a car, drive to the supermarket, walk into the store, and there's a big pile of perfectly ripe, beautiful apples that I can pick one, pay money, and leave and eat. But that is not how apples come to be. If I wanted an apple and I lived in the middle of the countryside, what I would need to do is I would actually need to find an existing apple tree that had tasty apples and graft it onto a new seedling. And then I would need to water it. I would need to guard it and care for it to keep it away from things that wanted to eat that sapling. I would need to wait years through the natural seasons of the world. And only then would the tree produce an apple and I could pluck it and I could eat it. Contained in that apple is that entire process of planting, caring, pruning, protecting, waiting, being patient, and finally having my desired outcome. This is the sort of process that we enter in working with ayahuasca. And so we need to understand that it's not going to happen right away. We need to just slow down and be patient, trusting that we are going to arrive at that thing over time, so long as we stay on that path. Essentially, what I'm saying is, for us sometimes to have that wild or beautiful experience that we've heard about, we first need to pass through a series of prerequisite steps so that we have a stable base and foundation upon which to have that experience. Essentially, what I'm saying is, sometimes for us to have that wild or beautiful experience that we've heard about, we first need to pass through a series of mundane or frustrating or painful prerequisite steps so that we can build a stable foundation upon which we are going to grow from. The time it is hardest for most people to practice patience with ayahuasca is when you're establishing that first connection with ayahuasca. Showing up and not getting what you've expected quickly can be really painful, and having to just wait and trust in that process is really hard. Just to set your expectations before you even get off the bus and arrive here, it is very, very rare to feel a connection with ayahuasca from the first cup. What we find is usually about half of the group, 50%, actually doesn't feel any psychological connection in the entire first ceremony. A lot of people just feel that the medicine is scanning through their body or cleaning them out. A lot of purging. It's kind of like getting the canvas ready to paint before jumping in. This is completely expected. I've seen a lot over time, though, when I say this, I can see in people's eyes, they're like, oh man, that sucks for the other 50%. They're not going to have the connection I'll have. No, it really could be you. And so given that there's kind of a coin's toss chance that you might not feel anything in the entire first ceremony, it's worth reflecting on what will my actual expressions of patience look like? Is it just an idea in my head, oh yes, be patient? Or is it really something, a way of being that will come out of me? It can be helpful to really just think about what will I do in ceremony? It's going to be a nice night out in nature. At the very least, there's going to be a fire. There will be nature sounds. Hopefully, if there's no clouds, you'll be able to stare up at the stars and enjoy the cosmos. Live music. The more that you're able to just relax and not be chasing after the thing you want, the more you're practicing the patience that Fernando is kind of recommending to all of us. Patience really is best done by just relaxing. In my opinion, personally, society pushes us into such frenetic, hyper-stimulated existences where we always have the ability to escape whatever we're feeling in that moment. So if I'm feeling angry or bored or sad, I can reach for my phone and read or watch something. So even just this fact of having time, 6 hours to be with yourself, even if you're not feeling anything from ayahuasca yet, that's valuable in itself, and I think it's worthwhile. Usually what we find is after the second ceremony, about 75%, 80% of the group has felt a connection. And usually, except for in rare cases, by the third ceremony, everyone is starting to work with ayahuasca. And the day ceremony tends to be kind of the cherry on top. If you still haven't connected after the second ceremony, patience and trusting the process can become very, very challenging. If you find yourself in that situation, the team will be here to listen to you and to help you through that and to kind of make a plan for getting that connection. But just know that I've personally seen it time and time and time again, and almost always without fail, the person gets that point and they understand the process that had to unfold to arrive to the point they did. So this is why I'm really recommending patience. As I said, though, when you're getting to that point, some people of not connecting as quickly as the other people in the group, it can become very painful. And one of the common responses is starting to question the dose and get really wrapped up in not having enough ayahuasca. And that brings me to tip number 4, which is trusting our Taita Fernando. So tip number 4, trust Taita Fernando. Given that ayahuasca is a medicine, it's really helpful to think of Fernando as a sort of spiritual doctor. In my personal opinion, of course, I'm a little bit biased. As far as spiritual doctors go, if you come to LaWayra, you've got a very good one. You would all be really, really lucky to drink with Fernando. Very few people come to LaWayra specifically to drink with Fernando. I think part of that is because Fernando doesn't do some of the self-marketing and self-promotion that some shamans are doing these days, but really he is top-notch. We had one patient here a number of times who drinks a lot of ayahuasca, like to the point that some shamans were telling him, I think maybe you should slow down, which is pretty rare for a shaman to say. And he had a spreadsheet where he would rank all of the shamans he'd ever drank with on a 10-point scale. I think the sheet had like over 25 shamans on it, and Fernando is in his top 3, which I think is pretty cool. Fernando, just to give you a little bit more background on our shaman, you'll meet him whenever you get here. He is the 6th generation of shamans in his family. So not only the medicine, but the shamanistic practice of working with the medicine and helping other people work with ayahuasca has been in his family for over 250 years. And so it's really in his blood. He himself started his shamanistic training at age 7, drinking ayahuasca at least 3 times a week for over a decade. And he's been practicing and kind of guiding people through this process since, I think, 16, when he finished his initial round of training. So he is really, really good. And this work truly is in his blood. The hardest and most important thing to trust Fernando on is the amount of ayahuasca he gives you. I'm going to focus a good bit on this specific expression of trust in Fernando, the dosage, for a bit longer than other forms, because I've seen so many people get really wrapped up in this and just lose a bunch of energy because they don't understand the dose. Ayahuasca dosing is really quite trippy and pretty difficult to understand. It mystifies a lot of people because it is so counter to how the dosage of most things that we interact with works. we expect the effect of most substances to be fairly predictable and consistent based on the dose, because that's how, most modern medicines and even other plant medicines work. So I think a good example of how we expect dosing to work is mushrooms. If any of you have ever taken psychedelic mushrooms, then the load of experience that you're going to have is pretty directly tied to the amount of mushrooms you take. So if I take 2.5 grams of mushrooms, I can say with a high level of certainty that experience is going to be fairly predictable. The strength of that experience will be very defined relative to if I took 1 gram of mushrooms or if I took 4.5 grams of mushrooms. I can also say, generally, that if someone else with me were to take 2.5 grams of mushrooms, their experience too would be quite similar to mine. So most medicine doses are both predictable, personally, and across a spectrum of people. Ayahuasca simply does not work like that. First off, the best dose for one person is highly, highly personal. There are a number of different factors that kind of determine the best dose for someone. Number one is their capacity to flow with ayahuasca, the skill set they have to work with this mental space, which is something I'm going to talk a lot about in the next module. What are the things you can do to help you work with ayahuasca? Other things are just personal chemical makeup. And this too is really counterintuitive. So we had an ex-professional basketball player here who was over 6'10", and he would take 3/4 of 1 cup and go super deep with the medicine. We have also had really small, thin folks here, like teeny people, and they would take 2 tipped up cups and feel very little. So that's pretty counterintuitive, right? It's not just medicine is tied to body size or weight, or the more medicine I have, the more connection I'm going to feel. That's really counterintuitive. Also counterintuitive is that the same dose for one person can produce different results. And so for me, some of my strongest experiences with ayahuasca have been on smaller doses, and I've taken even twice as much medicine on different nights than that strongest experience and had like a weaker experience. That's really counterintuitive. I think the best way to think about ayahuasca is the dose is one part of a very broad kind of multivariate equation that determines what our connection is going to be like. It's really easy to overestimate the importance of the dose in determining what experience we've had. One time, Sam, the founder and CEO of LaWayra, and we sat down and we tried to make a big multivariate equation determining what were the factors and the kind of weight of them and determining the strength of a connection people had. And the dose was just one small factor. And then I think there's maybe 12. Some of them were the dosage, the strength of the medicine, the stuff that Fernando's controlling, but it's also the physical makeup of someone, their emotional characteristics, history of trauma. We've seen that the sort of group dynamic makes a big impact. If you want to get into the more mystical stuff, there are things like sort of spiritual weather, group unconscious. There's a whole big range of things. But it's really easy because of how most dosages work for us to overestimate and get very fixated on the dosage. Trusting Fernando's dose, I want to just put out there, is really challenging because it's the most obvious explanation for why we're not getting what we think we should be getting from ayahuasca, or where I'm not having as strong an experience as the person next to me. If I didn't feel anything, of course it's because I didn't get enough. This is such a seductive mental pathway of explaining what we're feeling that even I, as someone who have drank over 100 ceremonies with Fernando and with ayahuasca, even still, I'll get my second cup. It'll be smaller than I thought I deserved. And I'll be like, what's wrong with Fernando? He doesn't know what he's doing. He gave me too little. I can handle more. I'm not weak. I should have lied at the altar. And then 45 minutes will pass. And I'm like, really tripping out. So it's important to be able to catch ourselves as we become fixated on the dose. The reason I'm spending so much time on this is really because it's an energy sink for people. People get fixated on it. They feel slighted. They feel angry. They feel as if this place is like just a quackery and that people are lying about the experiences they're having in word circle. The main takeaway I want you to have is it's really important to trust Fernando and the medicine he is giving you. I, in my time working here, have seen more or less every cup that he has served to people in the past 13 months. And I think of myself as a pretty smart, analytical guy, and I still haven't figured out the equation he uses for the dosage. And yet it seems to work perfectly over time. And so if I haven't been able to figure out if you're coming here for like a 7-day, 11-day, and 18-day retreat, it's going to be really challenging for you to figure out. And so instead of wasting energy trying to sort this equation out. Just trust that this guy that's been training in this work since he was 7 and that's been in his family for over 6 generations, that he really has a good sense of how this stuff is going to be working. Before I move on, I do want to make sure to not deify Fernando. He is a very powerful, wise guy, but he is not omniscient and all-powerful. Nor do I want you to think, the second I step onto the LaWayra property, I'm not going to be able to talk about dose at all. They're going to be really annoyed if I talk about it. Talking about the dosage is not a taboo subject. Of course, all of us at LaWayra, we're on the same team. We want you to have what you want to have. We want you to have these strong ayahuasca experiences. So we as a team are always curious about the strength or the sort of quality of your personal experience. If you want to go deeper, feel free to talk about that with us. Sometimes people want to dial it back too and have a more mild experience. They might have had a pretty deep one and kind of feeling a little intimidated. That too is fine. Please be in communication with us about that. The main thing just to know about ayahuasca, one of these expectations to sort of shift, is that there's a lot more at play in the experience you're going to have than just the dosage you receive. You should know that the final say is always going to be Fernando's on the dosage, and that final say, that decision, is both coming from a place of a high amount of insight and experience and the sort of clinical care for your well-being. Ayahuasca can be dangerous, and Fernando is in charge of taking care of you and maintaining the integrity of your mind. Trying to control the dose is kind of similar to if I shattered my femur and I was brought in an ambulance to the hospital. I go into the ER and I'm like, give me 10 cc's of lidocaine. And the doctor's like, we literally don't even measure lidocaine in cc. It's like, that doesn't make any sense. Think of Fernando as a really skilled spiritual surgeon, someone who is going to be performing surgery on you. And the best thing you can do is just relax into that process. Fernando knows what he's doing, and he has a lot of integrity in bringing people through ayahuasca experiences in ways that will truly help them change their lives for the better instead of destabilizing them and just throwing them back into the world. So what's really important for us to do with tip number 4 in trusting Fernando is kind of step back and just humble ourselves a little bit and trust that he has the deeper insight into the process that unfolds with ayahuasca. And he has gained that through thousands of ceremonies with ayahuasca and years of practice. So that's the most specific form of trust to practice with Fernando. Beyond the dosage, trusting Fernando is also super helpful. If you're nervous or anxious about ayahuasca, if you've heard horror stories, if you've heard it's super challenging, that you're going to be tortured or dragged through your defense mechanisms, anything like that, know that you're drinking with someone who is going to be able to take care of you. So if you're worried you're going to go crazy, you're not. Fernando is going to take care of you as long as you can just trust him to do his job. Once I had a patient who, in the very last word circle, after being here for an entire week, she was like, in my day ceremony, I finally realized that I can really trust the team, that they're here to care for me and that they're doing good work. When I got here, I trusted you guys, but what choice did I have? Which I thought was pretty funny. But I know that trust is something that is kind of gained over time and through experience with someone. So maybe you can just have a slightly quicker process towards that trust by hearing someone who has also gone through that process and found Fernando to be a really good guy and someone who's very skilled at this work. So I hope that if any of you are worried, you can just take this tip to heart and know that you're in the hands of someone who's really good at this work and that you're going to be totally okay. All you need to do is just relax and trust. This last tip, tip number 5, is kind of a summary of all of the previous tips. It kind of ties it all together. Tip number 5, approach this medicine with respect, humility, and gratitude. I think by now I've made it pretty clear how trippy, complex, and logic-defying ayahuasca is. But I haven't really talked about the power ayahuasca has and the importance of being humble and pacing ourselves in the face of that power. We tend to explain the intensity of an ayahuasca experience to people through kind of 3 levels. There's the lower end of the spectrum. That's the first level. Here, you might feel nothing. You might feel nausea and purging, the kind of cleansing and release that I mentioned. Maybe you feel a mild change to your mind, feeling very relaxed or at peace, some emotions coming up, memories bubbling to the surface. I didn't believe it at first when I got here. It actually took me a while to believe this, but I do now strongly believe that even in that space, something important is unfolding. Ayahuasca is working its magic just slowly and kind of bringing you to that desired outcome I was talking about. That said, we do, of course, we want to get you beyond that. We want to get you into the second realm that we talk about, which we call the golden zone. This is pretty hard to describe to someone before they've worked with ayahuasca, but really you kind of know it when you feel it. You just feel alive as a human. You feel the strength of emotions, of feeling. You can feel a deeper sense of connection to the things around you, to, God or the universe, the cosmos, whatever you believe. You just feel enlivened. That's kind of the golden zone. There can be changes to your consciousness, a change of a sense of self, visions, feelings of joy and euphoria, insights, crying, pain, discomfort, anger, all that stuff. Essentially, the golden zone is consciously experiencing the work of the medicine. That can be learning, seeing, feeling, releasing, and growing, but at an intensity that's not overwhelming you and frightening you. But you need to know that, like all medicines, just the idea of more medicine being better is not the reality. Above this golden zone is what I like to call no man's land. And no man's land is very, very frightening. Where that third level begins, that transition point from the golden zone to no man's land, is different for every person. It typically tends to be the extent to which you are able to let go of control and flow with severely altered states of consciousness. I'm going to spend the next section, we'll be talking about how to raise that transition zone so you're able to work a little bit more deeply with ayahuasca, but we must know that that place is not necessarily desirable. We get a lot of people coming through here who just want to go as deep as they possibly can, and it comes from a place of hubris, both not knowing their own limits and significantly underestimating the power of ayahuasca. In this zone, a lot of things can happen. You can have no idea where you are. You can forget who you are. Time can disappear. You can poop yourself. I personally have been punched in the face by someone in this zone before. Fernando, someone has tried to attack him. And then also, you don't really remember anything in the morning. I'm not saying this to try and frighten you and to make you think this is going to happen and you're going to freak out and it's going to be traumatizing. But really, you should know that this can happen. And this comes back to why it's so important to be trusting Fernando and the team, because it's really hard as people new to the medicine to imagine what this is like. I'm a pretty wacky guy. I like free solo rock climb, which means climbing without a rope. Ceremonies with ayahuasca when I've gone into no man's land have been way scarier than any experience I've had, like on the brink of death. So it's something to be aware of. A lot of people want to just be blasted into oblivion with ayahuasca, and I get that. I was honestly that guy when I came here as a patient. But you just need to be aware that ayahuasca can be dangerous. And if it's used or done irresponsibly, it can destabilize someone. It can damage their body and their mind, and it can traumatize them to the point that no one wants to work with ayahuasca again. This is where we as a team come in. We're not perfect. We make mistakes, and we absolutely need your feedback when you come here and start working with ayahuasca. But the reality is we're pretty happy to report at LaWayra, we are quite good. And you can trust us to help you navigate those three zones and keep you in a place that's going to be deep and beautiful and transformative and productive, but not bring you to that point where it's just not good for you to be. So to wrap this all up, the last tip I want to give you as someone who has traversed no man's land is please come to this medicine with healthy respect, humility, and pace. To be respectful of ayahuasca is to know that it is truly impossible to imagine the power of this medicine. Only when you are shown it can you start kind of thinking of how deep this thing can go. To be humble is to know that it is very, very challenging to have an accurate appraisal of our own skills and limits. And to know that no matter who you are, the medicine has the power to really take you to places beyond those limits. And so finding our own pace for the journey. Finally, to be grateful towards ayahuasca, as I said at the beginning, is to be open to and curious about everything that happens through our retreat. What we would call big or small, what we would call bad or good. Being grateful to this process, to this ancient, mysterious medicine, is being open to and curious about it all. So those are my 5 tips for working through these challenges that a lot of people confront with ayahuasca. To summarize, tip number 1, identify your expectations. Don't gag from the orange juice. Take some time to reflect and know what is your mind projecting about ayahuasca and how is that going to get in the way of you just meeting the reality of an ayahuasca retreat. Number 2, pairs nicely, be open to how expansive ayahuasca is. It works in incredibly broad, confusing, shifting ways. And so our capacity to just step back and be open to it is going to really help us. Number 3 is just being patient. All of these things are kind of interrelated. Just relaxing and knowing that a process is unfolding. We are always inherently, so long as we are putting in the effort, moving towards the growth and beautiful consumption of that apple, but we need to be patient as the natural world brings us to that desired outcome. Number 4 is trusting Fernando and more broadly trusting the team, knowing that Fernando is really skilled and highly trained and will be doing this work in a way that is going to be taking care of you. And so if you're anxious or worried about going crazy in Colombia, you don't have to be, because you're really lucky to be drinking in a place that has taken a lot of steps to ensure your safety. And if you're getting kind of wrapped up in the dosage, just remember that this is a very complex, confusing medicine that takes decades of experience to understand how it works. And again, trusting in Fernando and bringing you through that process. Finally, number 5, to wrap it all up, when you work with ayahuasca, it is so important to center respect, humility, and gratitude. Respect, humility, and gratitude. They say that when the Spaniards came to South America, the indigenous communities gave them the gold and hid the ayahuasca. This is a really sacred, ancient tradition that you have the privilege to be a part of. And so it's so helpful to try and humble ourselves and just show up open and excited to receive anything that comes in your experience here. I like to finish with a bookended story. So we started with the story of Klaus and the feline process, this crazy psychedelic thing that a lot of us are like, oh, that would be cool if that happened to me. That's part of ayahuasca. But I want to finish with another story that I also think captures a very important part of how ayahuasca works for people, and will point you towards the reality of how we have to be working with ayahuasca. This is the story of the man with the life insurance. So we had a patient that came here for a 7-day retreat, and before getting here, I think maybe in the months leading up, he had bought a life insurance policy that he made absolute certain covered suicide. He had been depressed for a number of years and felt like he had no hope left for his life, but he wanted to make sure that his wife and his daughter were provided for if he did end up killing himself. And he came to LaWayra kind of as a last resort. When he got here, he encountered a lot of the challenges that I just spent a while describing. In the first 3 ceremonies, he didn't experience anything from ayahuasca beyond just physical purging and cleansing and frustration and upsetness. It's not uncommon for a few people every month to want to quit halfway through and leave. It's like, why am I taking this thing that's just making me feel sick? I'm not feeling any better. Always, we do our best to convince them to stay and keep working with ayahuasca. And always, when they do, they are very grateful that they did. However, this guy was in such a state of despair and frustration and disappointment, feeling as if this last thing that, this magical thing had failed him, that he ended up leaving after 3 ceremonies. He left on the rest day. He left because he felt as if it wasn't working at all. But when he got back home to his kind of base environment, he, his wife, his daughter, and everyone in his community noticed a massive difference in him. He was back to his old self. He was vibrant. He was joyful. He was getting invited to a bunch of parties. He was able to play with his daughter and just be more involved in life. This, I think, is such an awesome story to combine with the story about the feline process, un processo felino, because it demonstrates the expansiveness of ayahuasca. Ayahuasca works in so many ways. It might be beautiful. It might be torturous. It might be crazy visuals or just all emotions. It might be strong or weak. You might have that feline process, or you might feel like nothing is happening at all. But having seen hundreds of people work with this medicine, I can say pretty confidently from my own perspective that regardless of what you think is going on, magic is happening underneath all of it. Your ayahuasca experience is just one part of a much broader thing. And everyone who comes here is at their own place in a life process, a healing journey, a spiritual path, or a relationship with the medicine. And so it's important to just get in touch with where you are and be patient with how you move through your process. I love these 2 stories because I think they demonstrate how diverse ayahuasca is and how the best way to experience it is to just relax and enjoy the ride. Instead of getting wrapped up in, is this working, or I'm not getting what I want or what I think I need, and just trying as much as you can to trust the process. Visions are cool, right? Feeling like a big cat is cool and wacky too. They're flashy, and it's natural to want something like that, particularly when people around you are experiencing it. But at the end of the day, that's just not what this work and what ayahuasca is about. This is about healing. It's about growing. It's about knowing ourselves. learning how to love ourselves, learning how to love the people around us, how to regain some connection with Mother Earth, with your true self, with God, whatever. This is so much deeper than just the thing that we feel in ceremony. And so on the one hand, Klaus demonstrates that it works in very mystical, confusing ways, where for 2 nights he didn't feel anything, and then he had a torturous 3rd night, and then he turned into a cat in the 4th day. And all of that came together to a beautiful process. And then the man with the life insurance shows us something else, that even when we quit, even when we feel like we've gotten absolutely nothing except for feeling sick on our mattress, ayahuasca is working and helping us. Our mental mind just struggles to appraise and figure out this process as we go through it. The man with the life insurance was so infuriated that ayahuasca wasn't working that he left early, paid extra money for a new flight. And yet, when he got home, he found that his life was transformed. I know this story is anecdotal, and probably if I was in your position hearing someone else say it, I wouldn't believe it, but I hope that it sticks in your mind and that you can kind of start seeing its truth as you exist here at retreat. I use it as an anecdote, but I've seen tens of people go through the same process of thinking they're not getting anything from ayahuasca. But once they're able to step back into finding their expectations, being open, being patient, trusting, and having some respect and gratitude, they find that really something very profound is unfolding. With all that said, the main takeaway is ayahuasca is going to be doing beautiful work for you. All you need to do is come here, take the medicine, relax, and be open. Very simple to say, very challenging to do. So I hope that some of these tips will help you prepare for what might come up in your retreat. But as I said at the very beginning, almost without fail, when people get on the bus, they have had what they needed and what they're looking for. It's a beautiful, wonderful, transformative place. It's done huge things for my life. It's done huge things for the hundreds of people that I've helped go through this process. And you should just come. So I know it was long to go through preparing for an experience you haven't even had yet, but thank you for listening. If you can really soak this stuff in, let yourself marinate in it for a couple of weeks or whatever amount of time you have before retreat, then it's going to make a big difference and you're going to be able to work super deeply with this beautiful ancient medicine. So we're looking forward to hosting you here, and I hope you're getting excited.